Good morning and welcome to Guided Meditations and More. My name is Ade Richardson, and this is usually a daily 8 a.m. Eastern Time meditation, but I've also been doing interviews with teachers, spiritual seekers, and just various types of people who come on and share a little bit about their journey. Today we have with us Alan Warlock, who also happens to be my teacher. So I'm excited about this interview. I'm just going to read a short bio. Author of Nothing Other, and that's this book right here. Really great book. I enjoyed it a lot. I read it a few times, and one of the things I really like about it is it's not very big. That's my type of book. And Raindrops Falling on the Ocean. Alan Warlock is a modern day mystic who has been a spiritual teacher for more than 30 years and has been a Trillium Awakening teacher since 2010. His presence, wisdom, compassion, and expression leave people feeling nourished on many levels. Alan has been featured on the giant show Buddha at the Gas Pump. It's not as big as our show, but it's a pretty popular show. And you can find out more about him on his website at nothingother.com. I'll post a link in the description for those who are interested to get to know a little bit more about Alan. And also, he has plenty of videos on YouTube. So if you Google him, I'm sure a bunch of videos will come up. So today's topic is New Human versus Old Identity. So good morning, Alan.
Thanks, Ade. Thank you. Is the audio okay?
Yeah, audio is fine.
Okay.
Perhaps you can unpack that title a little bit in your own way.
I think probably most people on your show would know by now that we're moving into a new era for the human being. Some of the thought leaders go so far as to say the new human will have a new name. No longer be Homo sapiens, it'll be maybe Homo universalis. I forget who came up with that name. But there are many changes that we're going through. And you could say it's an evolutionary leap for the human being into a new reality. The old human was dominated or predominantly led within the context of a separate identity, a basic feeling sense of being a separate entity in a world of separate entities, largely based on Newtonian mechanics and the Cartesian model. So the particular paradigm that's been prevalent on the planet now began around the 1650s, 1600s, when Descartes launched his thing. And I'm not sure about the dates, but it was around that era when this model of science began to replace a more tribal identity. And so now we're in the space of pretty intense separation. And it's time to move into a new, it's like, I don't think there's an alternative to moving into this new reality, new way of being human. So how it will look, I think, down the road, and I'm not a prophet or anything like that. I think we're going to find that we're more in tune with each other, more of a feeling of one being, more of a sense of, definitely a sense of cooperation and compassion. Now, I base this on the other teachers I'm keyed into and my own visions. I get visions. I don't know what else to call them. It happens kind of unpredictably. So I had a vision, I think it was in 2006 or 7. And I saw that it's as though all the people were on a big, what do you call that thing the kids in the park play on? It's like
Seesaw.
like a seesaw, yeah. So some of the people were on the side of power, force, domination, fear. And some of the people were on the side of compassion, cooperation. And there was a tilt so that the seesaw went in favor of those who preferred compassion and cooperation. It was quite a magnificent vision, very blissful, and kind of stunning to my outer reality. It's not the number of people who were on each side, because the person was multiplied by the person's level of consciousness. So it's not like 50% of people favored fear and power, 50% favored compassion. The percentages I wouldn't be able to say, because each person was multiplied by their level of consciousness, so that somebody who, looking at the Hawkins map scale of consciousness, 0 to 1,000, 0 being an inanimate object, and 1,000 being the level of an avatar, a master avatar, such as the master called Jesus. So those who are in higher consciousness have much more say on when we move into a world of compassion and cooperation. So that is, I think, in my words and my way of seeing things, where we are now. There's some of us who are tending to and cultivating, developing greater consciousness. And when I say consciousness here, I'm kind of always looking for a new and better word. It's not just the content of consciousness, which I call intelligence and knowledge, but it's the consciousness itself. But I would say the consciousness needs to be tended or cultivated, and it needs to be stabilized with an understanding that keeps the consciousness organized. That's not the right word either, but stabilizes it within a context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Which part?
The organize, well, for lack of a better word, organizing this consciousness.
Yeah, it's like consciousness itself is infinite. Consciousness itself is infinite, it's pure, and it's empty. It's empty of any form, any definition. If you can think of consciousness in and of and as itself. The content is what makes it available, what makes it stable. So having infinite consciousness, having access to that is one thing, but then integrating it into your current paradigm, into your body, into your mind, into your thoughts, that's the other part of it that makes it stable. It's kind of like this. If I bought a piece of land, now the place I live in now, we have 3 acres of land. And let's say I bought 3 acres of empty land, or 100 acres of empty land. That would be the equivalent of having the consciousness. But if I'm still living like an animal, sleeping on the ground and all of that, there's an instability that's still there. So the stability comes when I build a nice home and I live in the home. The home represents a paradigm of understanding, of knowledge and understanding. And it's not just conceptual knowledge, because that will always be, I would say, morphing or evolving or changing. It's more of an integrated type understanding. That starts with like when we build a house, we start with the foundation. We excavate, put in a foundation. And the foundation should be such a foundation that will accommodate the structure that's going to be built onto the foundation. You know, when I grew up in the mountains in East Tennessee, foundation for that original house was, you know, some farmers got together and they put a pile of stones and started building the house on top of it. So the day my parents built a nice brick home, what we say a modern ranch brick home, they couldn't just build on that old foundation. They had to start with a whole new foundation, because that old foundation is not going to accommodate the new structure. And in a way, that's what we're going through now, is the old foundation of the human paradigm will not sustain the new dwelling in which the human will live.
Well,
It's
it sounds
all kind of abstract so far.
yeah. Well, it sounds like there's two things that are going on here, and correct me if I'm wrong, or there is the human, the collective, and then there's the individual. So in terms of the individual human and the which is made up of the physical body, emotions, and things of that nature, is what you're saying that where that the foundation that we were given, that this old foundation, maybe it was made with I don't know, like if you go, there's the story of the three little pigs. It was made of straw or whatever it is. So it's made of, so this foundation is made of straw. This is what was passed down. These are the habits and, the tendencies that were passed down from my ancestors, from society. And that cannot, that structure is not sufficient for this new consciousness that is coming in. Is that pretty much?
Yeah. That's actually a good story. The three little pigs. In some ways, it's a good story. I think all these old stories had meaning in them, esoteric meaning. If you had the wherewithal, you could look more deeply into the meanings. Yeah, and I like what you said about the paradigm being passed down through the generations, far more than we would guess, or far more than most people would guess, in terms of what is running us unconsciously, what is causing us to speak the way we do, feel the things we feel, believe the things we believe. There's a lot of unconscious material that's simply passed down through the generations.
And how would how would one work with that in terms? I know there's different modalities and methods for, with this integration. Can you talk about, I mean, for me, as you know, one of the things that growing up that I had the tendency of doing was repressing emotions. That was my way. Is through blame, through distraction, through whatever methods, drugs and alcohol at one point. And I know that we all do it in, a lot of us, I won't say all, do it in different ways. What about the people that I have this feeling that I don't want to leave people out. It seems like there's some people that are aware of this and they want to work on this stuff, and there's some that don't. And I see them caught up in the dramas of life and blaming each other. And what happens with those people? That's one question as this new consciousness arises, for lack of a better word. And also the people like myself or others like me that want to find some way to prepare that foundation. Can you talk about some things that someone can do to approach that?
Well, my life has been about meditation. I started I practiced some meditation when I was 20, it was in 1972. I was what, 21 years old. Then I loved it. Found it very effective from the first moment I sat. And then that was Transcendental Meditation and Mahesh Yogi thing. I started that in 1972, went on and became a teacher within a year and taught that practice for many years, about 12 years. I did many 6-month meditation programs where we would meditate maybe 10 hours a day for 6 months. And then at some point, I realized that wasn't doing for me the integration I needed into my human self. Then I began a series of other practices that went on for a number of years. Then I began to make journeys to India and realized that I'm actually a very devotional person. And then I don't know that there's a devotional practice as such. It may be or it may not be. For me, it was just natural. And so what I teach in my work is I teach specific meditation practice. It could be called self-inquiry, but it's not the typical method or interpretation of Ramana Maharshi's work that is predominant in the world now. I've had encounters with Ramana Maharshi in the inner world, on the inner planes or dreams or whatever you want to think of it. So it's both in dreams and in meditations. I encountered him and certain other masters and developed a process that I teach online, a meditation practice. Now, I don't think meditation is for everyone. I just don't think that way. I think everybody has their own way. But I think also what's important is to work with our old emotional patterns and begin to convert the energy that they're made of into the energy of awakened consciousness. So I have a process that I work with very specific around that. So in my view, when we came from spirit, before we were conceived and born, we were in some version of spirit. I would say that at some point, now we're going beyond time, so it's hard to say in time, but at some point, we were perfectly in spirit. But then as the process of becoming human got underway, we developed the ability to be human within part of our spiritual potency. And in the context of that experience, we went from pure spirit into manifested form. That's a shock to the spirit itself. That's a trauma. And then we had to build out from that trauma an expression that gave it explanation, somehow that gave it context. So we went from pure spirit into form, and we developed an identity over a period of, let's say, many incarnations. If you prefer to think of one incarnation, fine, then it would come down through your ancestry. But that ability to be in the human form, in what we call density, in this world from spirit, it feels like you're going into separation. Being in human form comes with a feeling of separation. And that sense of separation is traumatizing. All of a sudden you feel separate and isolated, separate from God, separate from life, separate from other people. Now, the way those emotions developed and the way we manage the impact of the emotions as we went into separation becomes the pattern that eventually we have to, let's say, overcome. Overcome here means integrate that consciousness and energy back into the realization of our oneness with spirit, our wholeness in ourself. Is this making sense, or is it too abstract?
No, it is making sense. So it sounds like that trauma when we come into this human form, is kind of like the birth of this confirmation bias that we start. So, start
I would say,
attaching
yeah.
different things to that. And that and that's the beginning of this feeling of separation, because there is this knowing that there's this feeling that we're something grander, that
Yeah.
that more original sense of self. I mean, if it just from my experience of touching on that, a little bit in the this feeling of expansion, and then in contrast with this sort of feeling of density and confinement.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the contrast of those two that creates this original shock.
Yeah.
Almost everybody you know, everybody you meet, if you dig into them deep enough, if they will allow you inside, somewhere in them they have a feeling something's wrong with me. A dog will never have that feeling. I don't think so. A cat will never. A cat will definitely never have that feeling.
Yeah, we business corporations make a lot of money off of that feeling.
Exactly. They exploit it. Some of them knowingly, some of them it's just a way they've derived systems that are profitable. But that feeling of something's wrong with me then becomes a self-perpetuating sense. And we're always trying to overcome that feeling of what's wrong with me by exterior in the exterior world. And everybody has different imprints of that original shock. I call it the shock of incarnation sometimes. So that original shock then sets the stage for a kind of drive to figure out what happened, to figure out what happened, what went wrong, what happened, how did I get this sense of shock? When I was 3 or 4 years old, I concluded that these people had kidnapped me from my home and were trying to hypnotize me to think I was one of them. I literally thought I'd been kidnapped from, I don't know, another planet, another world. I didn't know what. I just knew I wasn't. I knew this human thing wasn't my real nature. Now, of course, I've matured way beyond that. Now, that was 3 years old at the time. I think I was 3, almost 4. I wasn't keeping track of time then because, see, part of that original, let's say original sin or original loss of a feeling of oneness comes with the idea I was born. See, this I was born is mostly a concept. If you ask anybody, how do you know you were born? They're going to say, well, I've got a piece of paper. My parents told me I was born. The truth is, see, I never took on the belief I was born. It just never happened to me because I remembered before coming into incarnation, I remembered what it was like in my original place. It's not even a place. It's an original state or original condition. None of those words are really workable here. The original status. I mean, I haven't found a word yet that quite explains it. But because I never took on the belief I was born, it didn't mean I had freedom all along the way, because then I took on the belief that I'd been kidnapped. I literally thought I was being hypnotized to think I was a human, which enabled a couple of things. It enabled me to see the development of the human identity more clearly than, let's say, the average person. Maybe not in total clarity. I'm not claiming anything like that about myself at all. But what I can say is we were conscious before conception. We were conscious during conception. We were conscious in the womb. We were conscious during birth. We were conscious after birth. So when was being conscious born? It wasn't born. What gets born is the idea I was born. So there's an association of my sense of self with a birth event that I was born at that time. Now that as a concept can be useful to unravel certain things. You have astrology charts and human design charts, which all those things can be very helpful to help you kind of live your life in practical ways. But it doesn't reveal your true nature, the truth of yourself before conception and the truth of yourself after what we call death. So the spiritual seeker wants to come to this knowledge, and it's not intellectual knowledge. Spiritual seeker, there's a difference between, let's say, to me, a believer. So some people say, oh, well, I believe this, I believe that. Personally, anything I believe is provisional. I don't believe anything because it's written in a book. I don't believe anything because even if I experience it, I don't believe it as such. I don't hold it as some sort of say, well, I have to believe this forever. The belief should always be relegated to what have I experienced so far? What have I experienced up till now that gives this belief validity? If I'm believing something and I don't have any basis for it to believe that, don't have any experience on which to base that belief, then what's the point? What's the point of believing that? It's not a belief, it's more of a hope. So the spiritual seeker is not willing to settle for any belief about himself or herself or pre-birth or after death. Spiritual seeker wants to know. So there's a striving, a seeking, a desire in the spiritual seeker to want to experience, have a foundation. So that's the reason practices like meditation are so important to a spiritual seeker. Developing a connection, developing a sense that's based on your own recognition.
And so one of the things that comes up for me when we talk about belief and experience, for example, in meditation, a lot of the experiences that come up for me, I question, because there is the experience, but then there is whatever my interpretation of that experience is based off of sometimes maybe what you're referring to is a different type of experience, but I noticed that sometimes my experience, the interpretation of that is I draw from things that were passed down from me. So the way that I've developed through life and things that were passed down to me. So I have these tools, that I can't seem to be without, so whatever experience comes up, even if it's whatever it's an interpretation. So it's always a lot of times in question for me, opposed to, in contrast with when I think maybe this is what you're pointing at in some sense, is when I do touch on my authentic sense of self, it's a different type when I'm, and I'll use the word experience, when I'm experienced from that perspective, there's a different feeling, for it. And I'm not sure if I'm explaining this correctly, because it's hard to put in words, some of this stuff.
I think you're pointing at something that's really important. I wouldn't say it's impossible. A few teachers and spiritual adepts have gone beyond all interpretation. And I can name a couple, but I may get their names confused. But they're very rare. Even if you look at the life of Ramana Maharshi, who was one of the most dramatic awakening experiences we have, and maybe I'll mention another one, but his teaching really also is integral with the scriptures he was born into. And like Eckhart Tolle, for example, had a very radical, very dramatic, sudden awakening experience. And I forget his age, sat on the park bench all that time. He then studied, I think it was for about 12 years, he studied all the old scriptures and teachings to try and put his experience in the context. Now, we know about these guys because they became world-class teachers. What about the ones who realized the nature of the self that nobody heard from? And in my experience, there are many of them. They just went in from the human paradigm of thought and belief and all that directly into the great consciousness, and pretty soon left their bodies. According to some of the yogis, about 90% of people who become what we call self-realized, they didn't continue. They just went into that great next whatever. So those of us, and I'm not claiming anything about myself. I don't make any, I don't. The only thing I know for sure is I'm a crazy old hillbilly. That much I'm pretty comfortable with. But I've had many kind of mystical levels of awakening, which I can't deny, and I can't undo their influence on me. And there's pretty much a constant sense of well-being that's it's deeper than my thoughts, and it's more in my heart.
Yeah, and
it's like as soon as I start to think about it or feel into it, I'm a little bit drunk. I'm a little intoxicated with it. And it's constantly there. And I don't know if that means I'm self-realized or not. I don't need a name for it. I don't even like having a name for it. But I can almost always, if not constantly feel it, it's easy for me to touch back into it. But it needs to be tended to, it needs to be cultivated in the early stages of developing that sense. And meditation is a powerful way to do it. Yoga practices, if they're done, I think there's a lot of yoga, so-called yoga, that's roaming around. It's not going to really do the trick, but if you get the correct yoga practice from a good yoga teacher, then that can be very helpful. I'm not saying meditation. I just want to make sure I'm not saying meditation is the only way. Maybe it may not be. I don't think it is. I think just by living your life in the way it's in an optimal way will also take you into higher levels of spiritual development. I don't think you have to do anything, but you have to sort of cooperate with the most benevolent movement of life. In fact, I think going into this new human era, I think it's kind of in the air, it's in the process. It's like there's a movement of existence that's taking the human being into this new era. And it's like being on the river. The one who's the most innocent on the river will be most easily carried by the stream. So the people who are the most innocent will be carried by this movement of consciousness. Those of us who tend to struggle a bit, we're going to be carried also, but it'll be a little more of a workout. If we're trying to swim upstream or downstream, it's going to be more of a workout. Now, who are the most innocent people on the planet? Children. So the children in their innocence will easily, and this is how I see it right now. I may change my mind tomorrow, but I think the children will kind of lead the way into this new reality. I think you're going to see more and more that children are going to, whatever their parents are trying to lay on them in terms of separation and ideas of conflict and polarization, children are going to say, we don't want any of that nonsense.
So it sounds like there is a, using the river analogy, there is a movement that's taking place, and if
Mm.
when we resist, it makes it more difficult. That's maybe perhaps what's causing a lot of the suffering. And what is your take on what's going on in the world right now? Can you talk briefly about that? Because we're seeing a lot of the pandemic, the recent violence. A lot of, I get a sense of there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of division. I mean, the division was probably already there, but it's a lot of stuff coming to the surface right now. Would you say this is
Yeah,
part of that, a side effect of this movement?
yeah, that's the way I see it. I see it. See, if you look at the whole population of the planet, only a very few people have developed any skill set in managing their emotional backup. It's most people just project it on, they just blame somebody. Anytime you blame somebody, I don't want to make it an absolute, but predominantly when there's blame, underlying that blame is some discomfort in your own self. And rather than deal with the discomfort within yourself, you project it out, you blame somebody. So one party, one side of the politics blames the other side blames that side. This people blames that people, those people blame another people. Rather than sitting within yourself and managing your own emotional state, blame somebody, project it out. So those old emotional patterns that have been handed down to us and which we've developed, and the reason we developed those old emotional patterns was to withstand the impact of feeling separate. I mean, again, I'm being a little bit too literal and a little bit reductionistic, but language is like that. We can't have language without reducing things to kind of artifacts of truth. But that impact of going into separation, or as we come into density as a human being and begin to feel the onset of separation, we build up defenses against how difficult it feels. Those defenses then establish patterns. Sometimes I call these survival strategies or survival codes. And they will continue to operate so long as we're alive. We'd have to go into that for another hour to roll it out. And even then, we'd only be touching on what that's all about. But we build up these defensive strategies to protect ourselves from the feeling of being separate. Now those strategies are going to run unconsciously for the most part, and they're handed down for generations. I oftentimes work with generational stuff, and I find that it goes back 4 or 5 generations, the origination of something that's running somebody. Let me think of it. I'm going to make up an example because when I work with people, it's very individual, and I work in total confidence, so I don't tell somebody else what happened to person A or John Smith or Joe or Jane. But let me see if I can make up something. A little hard to have any authenticity, but let's say somebody is eating excessive amounts of food, and they're overweight, and it could. I'm just going to make up an example. But when I go into that person's history, then I might find that 4 generations back, they had an uncle or they had one of the family members, a brother, or let's say one of the families had a child who just went crazy, in their opinion, went crazy. What did they do with that child? There was no institution 150 years ago. 100 years ago even. So oftentimes what they did, they locked this person in the basement, sometimes in chains, but they would be confined to a cellar or a basement, sometimes called a dungeon. They'd be confined there and fed very sparsely. They didn't feel right killing the person, but they couldn't let the person roam around in the world. So they would just confine them. And that person's deprivation and starvation gets passed down through the bloodline and affects the current generation. The children pick this up, especially when it's kept secret. Let me think of another example. Let's say a woman was raped by her husband's, I don't know. Let's say the husband's first cousin raped a woman. Now the woman, if she tells her husband 100 years ago, she told her husband, you know, your cousin raped me, he may very well throw her out of the house. A woman on her own 150 years ago was a very bad situation. So she decided rather than risk losing her home and her family, she would just keep it secret. Well, she kept it secret. She didn't tell anybody. But the energy of having kept that secret is now influencing generations down the line, 4, 5, 6 generations later. It's influencing how the men and women interact romantically and sexually and in the partnership of marriage. Unconsciously. It's still there, and heavily in some cases, heavily influencing, causing behaviors that, you know, the person goes to see a therapist, and therapist talks about it and do 100 sessions with the therapist. Unless the therapist is skilled in family constellation work or some similar process, they're never going to get to that information by talking about their current experience. There's no way to resolve it other that I know of. I mean, I'm sure there are methods. I think that even yoga or certain types of body work can release, because it's stored in the tissues of the body also. It's not just some abstract thing somewhere in space, but it's stored in memory. And there are many aspects of memory. The body has memory. There's memory on the mind. There's memory on the energy field. Everybody has what we call an energy body. So the layers of that memory of what happened 5 generations ago, 6 generations back, and how it's influencing our behavior and our thinking and our attitudes now.
And I think scientists are saying that the stomach has this memory and a great deal. I think they were saying, and I may be wrong about this, I'm no scientist, even more so than the brain. But correct me if I'm wrong, if you know any differently. But what I'm hearing is, for example, the person that was was deprived food, and so their way of dealing with that trauma, their way of, maybe they weren't able to, deal with those emotions. So that pattern is what the way of dealing with it, and the pattern is what is passed down, or like it's that energy. So that pattern manifests into a certain energy, maybe stuck energy or imprint left in the body that's made up of memory, and then that is passed down to the coming generations down the line. Is that am I explaining that correctly? Or
yeah. I mean, I don't know if we can explain it exactly, because I think it's quite complex. So yeah. You've also got ostensibly your other lifetimes. When I look at it, it's quite complex from my view. There's an elegance to it, but there's also a complexity. So in my case, presumably I have other lifetimes as a human. Presumably I have other lifetimes in other systems that are maybe other planets or other worlds, other realities. The human reality is one reality in an ocean of realities. I've experienced other, I don't know what to call it other than other worlds, vastly different realities than what we have here. And I think that some of us, or maybe all of us, I don't know, have had experiences in other realities. And now we're here having this experience. So that's an influence. Then you got the bloodline influence. Now there's also an influence of culture. There's an influence of geography. If you go to Berkeley, California, there's a whole different karma. There's a whole different soup of karma in the Bay Area than there is, say, in Boston or New York City or Washington, D.C. Just look on the East Coast, Boston, New York City, and D.C. area. When you go spend time there, it has a different feel to it. There's a geographical influence that's built up, influenced by the geography itself, the climate, and built up by all the different peoples who have lived there. So there's a karmic influence from that. There's a karmic influence from my mother's bloodline, from my father's bloodline, from my past lives. So it's a complex soup of karma. And I'm using that term right now without much explanation. I don't think we're going to have time to go into my ideas of karma. And what I'm saying is mostly just my ideas and my thoughts and where I stand right now. It doesn't mean I'm the ultimate authority on any of this. But you can start to see that every feeling we have, every thought we have, every impulse that comes, it has these past like programs. It's kind of like I don't know how the computer works, but I would imagine within the computer, there are programs and codes and all these things that are operating and causing the computer to do what it does and to work the way it does. So you could probably look at the computer. Somebody who really knows computers could look at it and say, oh, well, here's a program, but that program came from these people and these people had this training. And before that, there was this other programming. So the computer has its own bloodline, its own ancestry of programs. Like that, we have an ancestry of programs.
So it sounds like this karma, as you were saying, is very complex. We may never fully grasp or understand it, but it is useful to have some sort of a framework to work with.
Yeah, definitely. So when I do energy processing with people, I typically want to know what is the issue they're working with. What's the issue where they feel stopped? And then we work with that issue. And over a period of time, I'm not saying 100% of the time, but many, hard to say average-wise, I don't know, but many to most times, we can unravel sufficiently the impact, the programming behind that pattern, that they can get some relief from it. Some relief or total relief. I've had people I've worked with who were the doctor told them they had to have surgery. Certain problem was there, they had to have surgery. After a few sessions, no more surgery, no more problem. I've had a number of cases like that where there's dramatic turnarounds in an issue. But my thing is not so much the physicality of life, but it's the totality, it's the whole beingness of life. I'm more interested in that. And I've trained in a number of systems of how to help people with issues. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, or nothing like that. My main thing is how to help someone become more in alignment with their true nature, how to bring that alignment more into play. So we can call it spiritual awakening. I'm not too fond of that term, but we can use that term. In Trillium Awakening, that's one of the things we work with, is how to help the person recognize their whole being. Whole being means their infinite consciousness and their human mortal being. How to recognize the full spectrum and how to help them integrate that. Then I work specifically with energy patterns to release the old patterns so that we can repurpose the energy that's trapped in those old patterns, how to repurpose that energy into ways that will support our higher development spiritually.
So we're coming up on, it's about 10:52 right now. Is there anything, I know I had mentioned, and I totally forgot about the guided meditation at the start, but is there maybe a short practice or anything you'd like to do? You can use me as a guinea pig if you'd like, or you can, do some sort of whatever you feel to do.
Probably the easiest thing we could do is this on my YouTube channel. It's called a 1 Minute Meditator, I think.
Oh yeah.
We can do that because it's something anybody can do anywhere, anytime. It's just with your eyes open. You could do this in a board meeting. Let's say you're in a meeting, an important meeting, and you're feeling stressed and there's a lot of pressure. You could do it there. It takes maybe 30 seconds once you develop it. You just take an object, any object that's easy for you to look at. Any object that's like right in your view. If you're in an important meeting, you might look at a pen on the table or a phone that's across the table from you. Any object, just take that object and just look at it. And just really be with that object. And start to notice how quiet that object is, how tranquil. That object is not worried, not thinking about tomorrow, not remembering yesterday. The object is completely at ease. And let the tranquility of the object remind you of the tranquility in your own heart and your own mind, beyond and deeper than your thoughts and your worries. And if you're in a place, or if you're not in a situation that you can enter deeper into the meditation, just use that little technique to keep yourself kind of refreshed or resourced or grounded, whatever language you like there. They say that, I've heard top executives say that the person in the room who is the most tranquil is the one who really is in control of the outcome. The person who's the most peaceful or tranquil in a meeting is the one who has the most influence. If you're in a position where you can meditate, once you've kind of been with an object and located that sense of tranquility in yourself, then you can just close your eyes. And let that tranquility permeate through your body. And if you like, you can breathe a little deeper. An excellent breath is to breathe in, steady in breath through your nose. Say, breathe in for about 4 seconds, hold it for about 4 seconds. Breathe out evenly through your mouth. As you breathe out, you're going to breathe out for 1 or 2 seconds longer than the in-breath or the holding. Don't have to do that, but if you like, you can add that. And as you become more settled into your own self, into your tranquility, and you can begin to explore your sense of yourself, your own sense of your own existence. And you can explore, where is that in your body? Does it have a boundary? Where is the boundary? What is the nature of that boundary? Okay, so why don't we end that now? When you're ready, you can open the eyes and come back out. It's just for a slight taste of the practice. So I have other videos on YouTube, on the YouTube channel. And I do a guided meditations on Friday mornings at 10 o'clock. You have to go to trilliumawakening.org, scroll down to virtual programs, and you'll find a link there for the Friday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern time, guided meditation. There's a group of 10 to 20 people who come on Friday mornings, and we do that.
That's great. That's beautiful. And I'll send I'll post a link to your website and to the Trillium in the description of this video as well.
Okay.
So we're going to have to close, because I want to keep it, if it's over an hour, because I like to post these videos on Instagram too, but they only allow 60 minutes. So it'll save me some editing to on time. Is there any closing thing you'd like to?
One thing is I'll offer a free about 45-minute free session to your first, let's say the first 5 people that contact me from your show.
Great.
And they can get in touch with me through my website, or Allan, ALLAN, at nothingother.com. Or they can contact me through you, through your program. But thank you, Ade, and thanks to all whoever's out there that joined us.